Corporate fraud. It can feel like this big, invisible crime, right? Something buried deep in spreadsheets and quiet backroom deals. But what if there was a way to spot it? What if there was a code? Well, today, we're going to break down that exact code. It's a simple, three-part framework that's going to help you see the warning signs that almost everyone else misses.
And look, this isn't just about those huge scandals you see on the news. The red flags we're about to talk about, they can show up in companies of any size, which is why it's really worth asking yourself, could it be happening in yours?
Now, here's the good news. You don't need to go out and memorize some giant, complicated checklist of red flags. Nope. While the signs themselves can be pretty subtle, they almost always come from just 3 root causes. Once you learn how to spot these 3 conditions, you basically have the key. So here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at what creates the motivation for fraud. We're calling that the pressure cooker. Then we'll look for the opportunity. That's the unlocked door. And finally, we'll dive into the rationalization that makes it all seem okay, the broken compass. Okay, first up, the pressure cooker. This is all about those intense forces, both inside and outside a company, that can push otherwise decent people into making just awful decisions. It's right here, in this high-pressure environment, that the motivation for fraud really gets started. And this pressure, it tends to build in 2 different ways. On one hand, you've got corporate pressure, things like massive debt, big losses, or just that relentless demand from Wall Street to boost the stock price. But then you've got personal pressure. An employee who's suddenly living way beyond their means, or maybe they're going through a tough time, like a divorce or a bankruptcy. These are the stressors that can make people get, well, desperate. What's interesting is that this kind of personal pressure, it's usually not invisible. It often spills out into things you can actually see. Like the source material says, when people use stolen money for lifestyle improvements, you might notice a coworker suddenly rolling up in a fancy new car or taking these crazy vacations that just don't add up on their salary. That right there is a classic signal of pressure boiling over. And that leads to a really critical question you have to ask about the company culture itself. When hitting those earnings targets becomes the only thing that matters, you start to create an environment where bending the rules, it starts to feel less like a choice and more like a necessity just to survive. But here's the thing. Pressure alone is not enough to make fraud happen. It needs an opening. It needs a weak spot in the system. And that brings us to our second element, the unlocked door. The difference between a locked and an unlocked door is really all about a company's structure. Just look at this comparison. On one side, you have this high-risk setup. The board is full of insiders, there's no independent audit committee, and maybe one person has all the power to override controls. Now compare that to a company with independent directors and a clear separation of who does what. It's pretty obvious which one leaves the door wide open, right? An unlocked door is almost always the result of a chain of little weaknesses. So if there's no internal audit team, well, who's double-checking the numbers? If the accounting team is totally overworked, who's going to have the time to notice something weird? And here's a huge one, that one employee who never takes a vacation. You might think, wow, what a dedicated worker. But a lot of the time, it's a tactic to keep anyone else from looking at their books and finding out what they're up to. This is a massive red flag. Constant chaos at the leadership level isn't just a sign of instability. It creates these huge gaps in oversight. New people come in, they don't know what to look for, and when everything's in flux, controls and rules just don't get enforced. It is practically an open invitation for someone to take advantage. So you can have intense pressure, and you can have a wide open opportunity. But for fraud to actually happen, a person still has to cross that line. They have to find a way to rationalize what they're doing. And that justification, it becomes a whole lot easier when the entire organization's ethical culture, its moral compass, is broken. A strong ethical culture is a whole system. It's not just some code of conduct binder sitting on a shelf collecting dust. No, it's built on management actually walking the talk, it's built on regular training, and maybe most important of all, it's built on having real, strong protections for whistleblowers. When all those pieces work together, you create a place where doing the right thing is really the only path. Okay, now here is a question that cuts right to the heart of a company's integrity. Just think about it for a second. Auditors are supposed to be the independent umpires, right? They call the balls and strikes on financial health. So why on earth would a company keep changing them? I mean, maybe it's innocent, but it could also be a sign that they're searching for someone who won't ask those tough questions. Or maybe the last auditor got a little too close to the truth.
And let's be really clear about this. The conclusion is pretty unavoidable. This isn't just some minor issue. Experts consider this auditor shopping to be a classic, massive red flag for fraud. It suggests that a company is way more interested in finding a favorable opinion than an accurate one.
This question gets to the absolute core of a company's moral compass. If employees are afraid to speak up, if they can't question a boss's directive that just feels wrong or unethical, then that compass is truly broken. A culture of fear is a culture where fraud can grow and thrive in complete silence. So there you have it, our 3 elements: pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. Now, let's pull this all together and turn this framework into a practical toolkit that you can actually use to start spotting these signs for yourself. It all really boils down to this simple 3-point checklist. First, watch for the pressure. Are the demands to perform becoming totally unrealistic? Second, check for unlocked doors. Are there enough checks and balances in place, or can one person act without anybody watching? And third, assess the moral compass. Does the leadership just talk about ethics, or do they actually live it and protect the people who speak up?
You know, the biggest frauds, they don't start with a big explosion. They start with the quiet little details, a subtle shift in the culture, a corner that gets cut because of pressure, a door that's just left unlocked. You now have the framework to see these signs for what they really are. The evidence is always there, hiding in plain sight. So the only question left is, what will you see tomorrow?